Perhaps the most frustrating part of all of this is this: nothing happened. Nothing is wrong. Nothing demands attention. And yet, there is a strange feeling, as if something were about to happen, as if you needed to stay ready, as if it were not safe to fully relax. This sensation can appear in silence, in quiet moments, on ordinary days, without any clear reason, and that creates an uncomfortable question. Why does it feel like something could go wrong, even when everything is fine? The answer is often surprising. Your brain is not waiting for a problem. It is preparing for a problem. There is an important difference between those two things. Waiting means anticipating. Preparing means protecting, and protection is the number one priority of the nervous system. Many people describe a very similar experience: a subtle restlessness, a constant attention, a quiet sense of vigilance. It is not fear. It is not panic. It is not intense anxiety. It is waiting. A discrete kind of waiting, a continuous kind of waiting, a persistent kind of waiting, as if the body were on standby, as if the mind were monitoring, as if the system were conserving energy. This state has a name in physiology: anticipatory preparation, a biological mechanism that keeps the organism ready to act, even when there is no immediate threat. For thousands of years, this mechanism was essential for human survival. Waiting meant living. Relaxing too early could be dangerous. Letting your guard down too soon could be costly. That is why the brain learned to maintain vigilance for a little longer. A margin of safety, a margin of preparation, a margin of waiting. Think about something simple. You finished an important task. You solved a problem. You fulfilled a responsibility. And still, the body remains alert, as if something were still unfinished. That sensation is not an error. It is not an exaggeration. It is not weakness. It is continuity of preparation. The system has not yet received enough signals of closure. And when closure is not perceived, waiting remains. There is another interesting point here. The brain does not work only with events. It works with probabilities. If something difficult happened recently, the system learns. If there was pressure, the system records. If there was surprise, the system memorizes. When the environment becomes quiet, the brain continues monitoring, not because danger exists, but because possibility exists, and possibility is enough to maintain vigilance. Consider an essential detail. The nervous system prefers to be prepared and not need to act, rather than need to act and not be prepared. That logic explains why the mind remains in a state of waiting, even when everything seems resolved. There is also a common misunderstanding. Feeling that something might happen does not mean that something will happen. It simply means the system is ready. That state can feel uncomfortable, but it is functional. It is efficient. It is protective. Think back to a moment in your life when you had to stay alert, a period of pressure, a period of responsibility, a period of uncertainty. During that time, your brain learned something important. Being ready reduces risk. Staying attentive prevents surprise. Being prepared increases safety. And that learning does not disappear quickly. It remains, even when the period has ended, even when the situation has changed, even when life has become stable. Here is an essential detail. The brain does not relax when the problem ends. It relaxes when it perceives predictability. Without predictability, waiting continues, and waiting consumes energy. That energy consumption is quiet, but constant. Many people report a similar feeling. The impression of always waiting, waiting for a message, waiting for news, waiting for a problem, waiting for a demand, waiting for a change, even without a clear reason. At first glance, that may seem irrational, but there is biological logic behind that experience. The brain learns through repetition. If there were periods of instability, the system develops anticipation. If there were periods of pressure, the system develops readiness. If there were periods of surprise, The system develops vigilance. Over time, that set of responses creates a pattern of waiting, a pattern of monitoring, a pattern of preparation. That pattern does not appear by accident. It appears through adaptation. There is an important shift in perspective here. Waiting does not mean anxiety. Waiting means readiness. Readiness means energy, and energy means effort. When that effort continues for too long, wear and tear begins to appear. That wear and tear can show up as constant fatigue, difficulty, relaxing an active mind, subtle tension, continuous attention, a sense of alertness. Notice something fundamental. The brain does not need real danger to remain in a state of waiting. It only needs possibility. And possibility always exists. That explains why the system stays attentive, even when life is calm. There is a phenomenon many people have never noticed. The body can leave the situation, but the mind remains in expectation. This phenomenon is known as residual anticipation, a form of vigilance that continues after the event has ended. Imagine an alarm. If the alarm went off many times in the past, the system remains sensitive, even when the environment is quiet. That functioning is not a defect. It is memory, protective memory. The longer the system remained on alert, the longer it takes to leave the state of waiting. That is not failure. It is adaptation, and adaptation takes time. There is a point that completely changes the way we understand this feeling of waiting. The brain does not react only to what has happened. It reacts to what might happen. This way of functioning is known in neuroscience as predictive processing. Predictive processing, a scientific model that describes the brain as a forecasting system. Instead of waiting for a problem to appear, it tries to anticipate the problem before it happens. That strategy increases the chances of survival, but it also prolongs the feeling of vigilance. See how this works in real life. If you have lived through periods of instability, the brain learns. If you have faced unexpected changes, the brain records. If you have had to solve problems quickly, the brain memorizes. Over time, it begins to anticipate, not out of fear, but out of efficiency. This anticipation creates a state called baseline vigilance. Baseline vigilance is the minimum level of attention the brain maintains even at rest. It is like a background light, always on, always ready, always available. This state is natural. Every human being has baseline vigilance. What changes is the intensity. When the history of pressure increases, the level of vigilance rises. And when that happens, relaxation takes longer to arrive. Another important factor appears here. The brain does not handle uncertainty well. In fact, uncertainty is one of the most uncomfortable experiences for the nervous system. There is a scientific concept called intolerance of uncertainty. This concept describes the tendency of the brain to remain alert when the future seems unpredictable. It is not about fear. It is about preparation. Because uncertainty means lack of control, and lack of control requires vigilance. There is also a quiet biological preference. The mind prefers to wait for a problem, rather than be surprised by a problem. Surprise consumes energy. Surprise demands a rapid response. A rapid response demands effort. That is why the brain tries to reduce surprise. One of the most efficient ways to do that is to remain in a state of waiting. Notice a subtle but powerful phenomenon. The longer the system waits, the more energy it consumes, even without action, even without movement, even without a task. This energy cost has a name in physiology: allostatic load. Allostatic load is the physiological cost of remaining in a state of adaptation. It is the accumulated wear and tear of the body trying to maintain stability. That wear and tear rarely appears immediately. It emerges gradually, as persistent fatigue, as difficulty relaxing, as a feeling of tension, as an active mind, as constant expectation. Notice an essential detail. Waiting is not neutral. Waiting is work, physiological work, mental work, energetic work. Even when you do not notice it, think about something simple. You can be sitting, in silence, doing nothing, and still, the brain continues working, monitoring, calculating, predicting, adjusting. That activity is invisible, but it consumes energy. Another concept helps clarify this. The brain functions as an energy management system. It tries to use energy in the most efficient way possible. That means it prefers to maintain a constant level of readiness, rather than alternate between full alertness and deep relaxation. Switching states requires more energy. Maintaining readiness requires less effort. This pattern is known as chronic readiness, a state in which the system remains prepared continuously, not because danger exists, but because that pattern has become predictable. This state explains why some people find it difficult to fully switch off, even on vacation, even at home, even during moments of rest. This is not a psychological problem. It is a physiological state. The system remains prepared. There is also a quiet cycle that sustains this experience. This cycle is called the anticipation loop. The mechanism is simple. The brain predicts. The body prepares. The mind waits. Energy remains active, and the waiting continues. This cycle can repeat for days, without a real event, without a concrete threat, without a visible problem. At this point, an essential detail becomes clear. The brain does not know when to stop on its own. It needs signals, clear signals, repeated signals, consistent signals. Without those signals, the system remains in waiting. It is important to understand something here. Waiting does not mean weakness. Waiting means responsibility. Responsible people often develop a greater capacity for anticipation, a greater capacity for prediction, a greater capacity for monitoring. Those abilities increase efficiency, but they also increase wear and tear. There is a very common experience associated with this: the feeling of always being ready, always attentive, always available. This state is known as the chronic readiness response, a condition in which the system remains prepared for long periods. That pattern is useful in risky situations, but it becomes exhausting when it continues for too long. Here is where an important shift in perspective appears. You are not stuck in the past. You are prepared for the future. That sentence summarizes how the system works. There is still one essential element that many people overlook. The brain needs closure. Physiological closure. Closure means a clear signal that the task has ended. Without that signal, the system remains active. With that signal, relaxation begins. Consider a simple situation. A problem was solved, but it was not recognized as solved. In that situation, the brain continues waiting. That happens because the system needs confirmation. This detail changes everything. The mind does not relax when the problem ends. It relaxes when it perceives that the problem has ended. That difference is decisive. Look at a practical example. You complete an important project. Even so, you keep thinking about it, reviewing it mentally, waiting for feedback, waiting for evaluation. That state is waiting, not because the work is still happening, but because closure has not yet been perceived. When closure happens, vigilance decreases. When vigilance decreases, activation reduces. When activation reduces, wear and tear decreases. That process allows relaxation. There is another important principle here. The brain seeks predictability. Predictability means safety. Safety allows relaxation. Without predictability, waiting continues. And here, a deeper shift in interpretation becomes possible. The feeling of waiting is not a problem. It is a mechanism of protection. Prolonged protection creates wear and tear. Balanced protection creates safety. The goal is not to eliminate protection. The goal is to allow closure. At this point, it is worth revisiting the most important insights from this video. You may have realized that the brain functions as a prediction system, a model known as predictive processing. You may have noticed that baseline vigilance keeps the system attentive even at rest. That intolerance of uncertainty increases the feeling of waiting. That allostatic load represents the physiological cost of adaptation. At certain moments, it may have become clear that chronic readiness keeps the body prepared for long periods. You may also have recognized the anticipation loop, a cycle that keeps the system active even when nothing has happened. And perhaps the most important realization of all, relaxation depends on closure. If any of these ideas made sense to you, share in the comments what stood out the most. It could be a sentence, an insight, a concept, or even a turning point. Because clarity often begins when we can name what we are experiencing. And when you share that realization, someone else may finally understand their own experience. There is still one question worth reflecting on. What if the problem is not danger? What if the problem is constant waiting? That question changes perspective because it reveals something essential. You are not waiting for a problem. Your brain is trying to avoid surprise. That means your system is working. Perhaps the most important realization of all is this: your mind is not stuck, it is prepared. But prolonged preparation consumes energy, and sustained energy leads to exhaustion. So there is a quiet choice: continue waiting or allow closure. And that decision begins with understanding. If this video helped you understand something new, there is a natural next step. You can continue expanding your awareness. In the video, why relaxing feels so hard for your mind, or in the playlist, when your mind won't stop. Because sometimes the mind does not need silence. It needs understanding, and understanding changes everything.